patient about it every day. I dream that one day I'm gonna wake up and this is gonna be a nightmare. But yes, I believe that my son is out there somewhere. I believe that we are going to find him. We are going to bring him home.
You can, there's no words, there's no way to put how this actually feels. And anybody that can, I don't see how.
Every day, it's like waking up to this reality that it's actually real. I mean, Sebastian should be home with us. I believe that my son is out there somewhere. I believe that we are going to find him. Katie Proudfoot's voice trembles with emotion, a mother's hope, a mother's plea. But the evidence says otherwise. On the night of February 25th, 2024, 15-year-old Sebastian Rogers vanished from his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. No scent trail, no footprints, no exit. Massive search efforts turned up nothing. K-9 units found no trace. Helicopters scoured the woods. Volunteers combed every inch of terrain. And yet, Sebastian was gone. But here's what investigators discovered. A timeline that doesn't add up. A household with secrets. And a stepfather whose story keeps changing. What if Sebastian Rogers never left home at all? What if the answer to his disappearance isn't in the woods behind his house, but inside the walls where he was last seen alive? This is the case they don't want you to question, but the evidence demands it. Sebastian Wayne Drake Rogers, 15 years old, a boy with bright eyes, a gentle spirit, and a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. He lived in Hendersonville, Tennessee, a quiet community in Sumner County, just north of Nashville. Sebastian loved routine. He thrived on predictability. And on the night of February 25th, 2024, he followed that routine one last time. According to his mother, Katie Proudfoot, and his stepfather, Chris Proudfoot, Sebastian went to bed around 9 p.m. that night. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just another evening in the Proudfoot household. But sometime during the night, Katie says she heard a noise, a thud. She called out to Sebastian. In some versions of her story, he responded. In others, he didn't. The details shift depending on which interview you watch. By the next morning, Sebastian was gone. His bedroom was empty. His glasses, something he needed to see clearly, were left behind. The home showed no signs of forced entry. No windows were broken. No doors were left open. And yet, a 15-year-old boy with autism, who had no history of running away, had seemingly vanished into thin air. The response was immediate and massive. Local law enforcement launched a full-scale search. K-9 units were deployed. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the area. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation got involved. The FBI joined the effort. Volunteers from across the state poured into Hendersonville, combing through woods, fields, and waterways. Search teams covered thousands of acres, but they found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no scent trail leading away from the house. It was as if Sebastian had simply ceased to exist. And that's when investigators started asking a different kind of question. Not where did Sebastian go, but how did he leave? And more importantly, did he leave at all? Because here's the problem. Nothing about this case makes sense. The timeline is fractured. The stories don't align. The physical evidence contradicts the narrative. And the two people who were supposed to protect Sebastian, the last two people to see him alive, can't keep their story straight. Before we go further, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far Sebastian's story has reached, because the more people who know his name, the harder it becomes to bury the truth. To understand what really happened to Sebastian Rogers, we have to start where every investigation starts: the timeline. In any missing person investigation, the timeline is sacred. It's the foundation upon which every theory, every search strategy, every investigative decision is built. Investigators need to know: when was the victim last seen? Who saw them? What were they doing? What happened next? These aren't optional details. They're the backbone of the case. And in the disappearance of Sebastian Rogers, that backbone is shattered. Let's start with the thud. Katie Proudfoot has told this story multiple times, but each time she tells it, the story changes. In one interview, she says she heard a noise around 10 p.m. She dismissed it, told Sebastian to go to sleep. Simple enough. But in another interview, The thud happens at 1 a.m. 3 hours later. That's not a minor discrepancy. That's a completely different timeline. A 3-hour gap changes everything. It changes the window of disappearance. It changes when Sebastian was last confirmed alive. It changes the entire investigative model. And then there's a third version. In this one, Katie describes a full verbal exchange. She hears the thud. She calls out to Sebastian through the door, and he responds, "No, ma'am," before she tells him to settle down and go back to sleep. So which is it? Was it 10 p.m. or 1 a.m.? Did Sebastian respond, or didn't he? These aren't small details you forget under stress. These are the last moments a mother heard her son's voice. And yet, the story keeps changing. Pause for a second. In a missing child case, the timeline is everything. It's the backbone. And when that backbone is broken, the whole story falls apart. But it doesn't stop there. Katie's account of her own activities that evening is just as unstable. In early interviews, she says she sent Sebastian to bed at 9 p.m. and then she went to bed herself around midnight. Straightforward. But later, she adds new details. She was on the phone for a long period. She was intermittently falling asleep on the couch. Then, in yet another version, she says she was reading, working on a chapter for a business administration course. Reading, on the phone, falling asleep. These activities can't all be true at the same time. And this isn't about memory lapses. This is about the hours between 9 p.m. and midnight, the exact window when Sebastian was last known to be alive. If Katie can't maintain a consistent account of what she was doing during those critical hours, how can investigators trust anything else she says? When someone changes their story about their own behavior not once, but multiple times, it's not forgetfulness, it's reconstruction, it's narrative adjustment. And that's a red flag. Now let's talk about Chris Proudfoot. In one interview, Chris confidently states that he has taken a polygraph test. Not only that, he says he passed. He even suggests that both he and Katie passed their polygraphs, as if that settles the matter. But when pressed in a later interview, Chris changes his tune. He says polygraphs have been done, but he's vague about the details. And then, under direct questioning, he admits the truth. He has never taken a polygraph at all. Wait, what? You either took a polygraph or you didn't. This isn't a gray area. It's a yes or no question. And Chris has given both answers. Now, let's be clear, polygraphs aren't admissible in court. They're not reliable indicators of truth. But that's not the point. The point is that Chris lied about taking one. He used the claim as a shield, as proof of his innocence, and then later admitted it never happened. If he's willing to lie about that, what else is he lying about? Then there are the phone logs. Chris brings them up repeatedly, unprompted, in multiple interviews. He says the logs show that Katie was on the phone between 9:43 p.m. and 9:46 p.m., and that this proves she was awake and behaving normally during the crucial hours. But here's the problem. Those phone logs don't clarify anything. They contradict the other versions of Katie's story. If she was on the phone, why does she say in another interview that she was reading? If she was reading, why does she describe being exhausted and falling asleep on the couch? And if she was awake and alert enough to be on the phone and reading, why didn't she check on the thud? The phone logs don't exonerate anyone. They highlight the inconsistencies. Forensic investigators know this. When caregivers can't maintain a stable account of the final verified hours, the focus shifts inward. It has to. Because if the people closest to the victim can't tell a straight story about what happened, it's not the timeline that's broken, it's the narrative. And here's what makes this so painful. While Chris and Katie argue over timestamps, contradict themselves, and shift their stories, Sebastian is still missing. A child is gone, and the two people who should be providing clarity are instead creating confusion. A fractured timeline isn't just a credibility problem, it's a structural failure. When the foundation collapses, everything built on top of it becomes suspect. Every claim, every explanation, every defense. In this case, the timeline doesn't just contain gaps, it contains impossibilities. Sebastian can't have responded verbally at 10 p.m. and also fallen silently at 1 a.m. Katie can't have been reading, on the phone, and asleep at the same time. Chris can't have both taken and not taken a polygraph. These contradictions aren't subtle, they're glaring, and they force investigators to ask a question that no one wants to hear. If the people in that house can't tell the truth about the timeline, what else are they hiding? But the timeline isn't the only thing that doesn't add up. What happened next is even stranger. In the days immediately following Sebastian's disappearance, while search teams combed the woods and volunteers distributed flyers, something unusual happened. According to multiple community sources, Chris Proudfoot's parents, his mother and stepfather, made a sudden decision. They left Tennessee. And they didn't just leave the state, they drove to Alaska. Now, this detail remains unverified by law enforcement. It comes from community accounts, online discussions, and individuals close to the case. But if true, it raises questions that can't be ignored. Because in missing person investigations, sudden long-distance travel by family members, especially those connected to the household, is a red flag. Let's break down why this matters. First, the timing. According to reports, Chris's parents left shortly after Sebastian was reported missing. Not weeks later, not months later, immediately. In the early, critical phase of the investigation, when most families stay close, offer support, and remain available to law enforcement, Chris's parents allegedly did the opposite. They put thousands of miles between themselves and the epicenter of the search. In forensic analysis, early post-incident behavior is one of the most reliable indicators of internal knowledge. People who have nothing to hide tend to stay put. They want to help. They want to be visible. They want to cooperate. But people who are connected to concealed actions often engage in what's called displacement behavior, creating physical distance, altering routines, removing themselves from scrutiny. Whether intentional or not, a sudden departure to one of the most remote regions in North America fits that profile. Second, the destination. Alaska isn't a typical travel choice for someone responding to a family crisis. It's not a place you go for a quick getaway or to clear your head. From Tennessee to Alaska, the driving distance exceeds 4,000 miles. You're crossing multiple states. You're crossing into Canada and back into the United States. You're entering a region with vast wilderness, low population density, and limited surveillance. Alaska's interior is one of the most difficult terrains in North America to search, monitor, or investigate. If someone wanted to create distance, not just physical, but operational, Alaska would be an effective choice. Now, let's talk about the method of travel. Reports indicate that Chris's parents drove to Alaska rather than flying, and from a forensic transportation perspective, that choice matters. Air travel requires identity verification, security screening, and baggage checks. There's a paper trail. There are records. There are people handling your luggage, inspecting your belongings, and documenting your movement. Driving, on the other hand, allows continuous control. You maintain possession of your vehicle's interior for the entire journey. There are no mandatory inspections, no baggage handlers, no third-party oversight. You stop when you want. You travel through areas with minimal law enforcement presence, and if you're crossing into Canada, the border checkpoints are far less rigorous than airport security. This doesn't prove anything, but it does establish feasibility. If someone wanted to transport anything without detection, a private vehicle on a cross-country route provides far more autonomy than commercial air travel. And here's the question that investigators would naturally ask: was the vehicle inspected before they left? In high-priority missing child cases, household vehicles are routinely examined. So are vehicles belonging to close relatives. If Chris's parents left Tennessee in the early days of the investigation, did law enforcement have the opportunity to inspect their vehicle? Did they request it? Was it granted? Without public confirmation, we don't know. And that gap in information is significant. Now, let's add context. At the time of Sebastian's disappearance, the Proudfoot household was under pressure. There was an active CPS investigation involving Chris. There were allegations of inappropriate discipline, and Chris was in the middle of a custody battle over his daughter, Faith. If Sebastian's report to CPS was validated, it could have destroyed Chris's custody case. That's not speculation, that's legal reality. Courts consider the treatment of all children in a household when assessing parental fitness. A confirmed CPS finding would have been devastating. So here's the picture: a household under legal scrutiny. A child who triggered that scrutiny suddenly disappears, and within days, the stepfather's parents allegedly leave the state, driving thousands of miles to one of the most remote, difficult to investigate regions in the country. Is that a coincidence? Maybe. People travel for all kinds of reasons. Maybe they had plans. Maybe they needed space. Maybe they were grieving in their own way. But investigators don't dismiss patterns just because they might be coincidental. They examine them. They ask questions. They look for corroboration. And in this case, the Alaska departure exists in a zone where timing, logistics, and context all intersect. It's not proof of involvement, but it's not irrelevant either. What do you think? Coincidence or something more? Let me know in the comments. Because here's the thing. When you map out the pressures surrounding the Proudfoot family in the weeks before Sebastian disappeared, a pattern starts to emerge. The CPS investigation, the custody battle, the timeline inconsistencies, and now, an unexplained cross-country departure. Each piece on its own might not mean much, but together, they start to tell a story. To understand why this trip matters, we need to talk about what was happening inside the Proudfoot home before Sebastian vanished. To understand the pressure inside the Proudfoot household in the weeks before Sebastian disappeared, you have to understand what Sebastian did, what he reported, and what that report set in motion. Sebastian Rogers told someone at school that his stepfather, Chris Proudfoot, had hit him with a belt. That disclosure triggered a Child Protective Services investigation, and in that moment, Sebastian became more than just a teenager living in that home. He became a witness, a reporter, the catalyst for legal scrutiny that could unravel everything Chris was trying to build. But here's where the story gets murky, because Chris Proudfoot can't seem to keep his timeline straight. In early interviews, Chris admits the belt incident happened. He doesn't deny it, but he frames it as ancient history, something that occurred years ago, a one-time disciplinary action that was blown out of proportion. He downplays it, minimizes it, suggests it's not relevant to Sebastian's disappearance. In one interview, he specifically says the incident happened about 3 years ago. He's confident, dismissive, even, as if the passage of time makes it irrelevant. But then, Nancy Grace got involved. During her interview with Chris, she pressed him on the timeline, and that's when the story fell apart. Because Chris, in his own words, revealed that Sebastian was 15 years old when the belt incident occurred, and Sebastian had only turned 15 inches, December of 2023. Do the math. If Sebastian was 15 when it happened, and he turned 15 inches December, then the incident couldn't have occurred 3 years ago. It happened between December 2023 and late January 2024, just weeks before Sebastian disappeared. Not 3 years. Weeks. That's not a minor memory lapse. That's a deliberate attempt to distance himself from a recent, legally significant event. And when confronted with his own contradiction, Chris couldn't explain it away. The timeline compression matters. It places an active CPS investigation directly before Sebastian's disappearance. And in missing child cases, recent CPS involvement is one of the highest risk factors investigators look for. But Chris's contradictions don't stop there. In some interviews, Chris claims that CPS didn't file anything. He says it casually, as if the investigation was a non-event. No paperwork, no follow-up, nothing to worry about. But in another interview, Chris tells a completely different story. He describes the CPS caseworker arriving at the house the same evening Sebastian allegedly made the report. He says the worker was familiar with the family, implying there had been prior contact. He describes the scene in detail. The children were sitting at the dinner table. The caseworker spoke with Sebastian privately, outside. And afterward, she allegedly reassured Chris, telling him everything was fine after hearing his explanation. So which is it? Did CPS not file anything? Or did a caseworker come to the house, interview the children, and conduct an investigation? Both can't be true. If a CPS worker came to the home, spoke to Sebastian, and documented the visit, then something was filed. That's how CPS works. They don't make house calls and leave no record. Every visit, every interview, every allegation is documented. It has to be because those records can be subpoenaed, reviewed by courts, and used in custody proceedings. And that's where this gets critical, because CPS involvement isn't just about whether Chris disciplined Sebastian inappropriately. It's about what that finding could do to Chris's legal standing. At the time of Sebastian's disappearance, Chris was actively fighting for custody of his daughter, Faith. Custody cases hinge on parental fitness. They rely on documented behavior, credibility, and the treatment of all children in the household, not just the one you're fighting for. A validated CPS report confirming that Chris struck a special needs teenager with a belt would be devastating in a custody battle. It would corroborate allegations made by Chris's ex-wife. It would raise questions about his judgment, his temper, and his suitability as a caregiver. It could end his custody case before it even reached a courtroom. And Sebastian was the one who made the report. Let that sink in. Sebastian, a 15-year-old boy with autism, living in a home where he was already vulnerable, trusted someone enough to speak up. He told a teacher, or a counselor, or someone at school what had happened. And that act of courage set off a chain reaction. CPS got involved. An investigation began. And Chris, who was already under pressure from a custody battle, now faced the possibility of documented evidence that could destroy his case. In forensic analysis, this is what's called a pressure vector. It's not proof of guilt. It's a measurable stressor that can influence behavior. And when that stressor is tied directly to a child, when that child's testimony is the thing standing between you and a legal catastrophe, investigators pay very close attention. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When a child triggers a CPS investigation and that child suddenly disappears, it's not a coincidence investigators can ignore. It's a pattern they've seen before. Children who report abuse are vulnerable. They're at higher risk. And when the system is slow, when the investigation is still ongoing, when the outcome is uncertain, those children are in danger. Sebastian spoke up, and then he was gone. That timeline, the proximity of the CPS report to his disappearance, is one of the most significant elements of this entire case. It establishes motive pressure. It shows that Sebastian wasn't just a stepchild in the home, he was a legal variable, a threat to Chris's objectives, a voice that could validate everything Chris's ex-wife had been saying about him, and Chris knew it. You can hear it in the way he talks about the CPS investigation, the way he minimizes it, the way he changes the timeline, the way he insists nothing was filed, even as he describes the caseworker's visit in detail. He's not confused. He's managing the narrative. He's trying to control how people perceive the CPS involvement because he knows how damaging it is. But the facts don't lie. The timeline doesn't lie. And Sebastian's voice, the one that spoke up, the one that triggered the investigation, has been silenced. If you're finding this case as disturbing as I am, make sure you're subscribed. We're covering cases like this every week, stories the mainstream media won't touch. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next one. Because Sebastian's story deserves to be heard. And the more people who know the truth, the harder it becomes to hide it. But CPS wasn't the only pressure Chris was facing. There was something else at stake, something that might explain everything. At the center of the Proudfoot household, beneath the surface of daily routines and family dynamics, there was a battle being waged. A legal battle, a custody battle. And it wasn't about Sebastian. It was about Chris Proudfoot's daughter, Faith. Chris was fighting for custody of Faith. And in the world of family court, custody cases are wars of credibility. They're built on documented behavior, character assessments, and the testimony of those who've witnessed how a parent treats their children. Judges don't just look at how you treat the child you're fighting for, they look at how you treat all the children in your care. And that's where Sebastian becomes critical. Because Sebastian wasn't just Chris's stepson. He wasn't just another kid in the house. He was a legal obstacle, a witness whose testimony could validate every allegation Chris's ex-wife had made, a voice that could destroy Chris's entire custody strategy. Let's connect the dots. Chris's ex-wife, Nena, had made serious allegations about Chris's behavior. According to court documents and statements attributed to her, she raised concerns about his temper, his treatment of the children, and the involvement of his extended family in ways she described as aggressive and coercive. Whether those allegations were accurate or exaggerated is almost beside the point. What matters is that they were on the record. They were part of the custody dispute, and Chris needed to discredit them. But then Sebastian went to school and reported that Chris had hit him with a belt. That report triggered a CPS investigation. And if CPS validated Sebastian's claim, if they documented that Chris had used corporal punishment on a special needs teenager, it wouldn't just be a mark against Chris. It would be corroboration. It would give weight to everything Nena had been saying. It would show a pattern, and in custody court, patterns matter. Let's be clear, motive doesn't prove guilt, but it does explain pressure, and pressure explains behavior. Chris wasn't just facing a CPS investigation, he was facing the collapse of his custody case. Because here's how family court works. If CPS finds that you've engaged in inappropriate discipline, that finding can be introduced as evidence. It can be used to question your judgment, your parenting methods, and your fitness as a caregiver. It can influence visitation rights, custody arrangements, and even supervised access requirements. A validated CPS report doesn't just complicate a custody case, it can end it. And Sebastian was the one who made the report. Sebastian was the linchpin. His testimony was the thing that could tip the scales. If he stood by his statement, if CPS believed him, if the investigation moved forward, Chris's chances of gaining custody of Faith would plummet. So what happens when a child becomes a legal obstacle? When their voice threatens to unravel everything you've been fighting for? In most cases, nothing. Most parents, even under pressure, would never harm a child. They'd work within the system. They'd cooperate with CPS. They'd adjust their behavior and move forward. But this isn't most cases. Because according to community sources and statements attributed to Nena, Chris's family, particularly his mother and stepfather, were deeply invested in the custody battle. Some accounts describe them as aggressively involved, allegedly making threats, engaging in coercive behavior, and treating Nena's children with hostility. These characterizations are unverified, and we have to be careful not to treat them as fact. But their existence within the narrative provides context. If Chris's extended family saw the custody of Faith as a central mission, if they viewed Sebastian's CPS report as a threat to that mission, then Sebastian's role in the household changes. He's no longer just a stepchild. He's an impediment, a problem, a variable that needs to be managed. And when you combine that perception with the timeline, the fact that Sebastian disappeared just weeks after making the CPS report, just as the investigation was ongoing, just as the custody hearing was approaching, the pressure chain becomes undeniable. Here's the sequence. Sebastian reports the belt incident. CPS opens an investigation. Chris's custody case is suddenly at risk. The stakes are enormous, not just for Chris, but for his entire family, who are allegedly invested in the outcome. Sebastian's testimony becomes the deciding factor. And then, before CPS can complete their investigation, before Sebastian can be interviewed again, before the custody hearing can proceed, Sebastian disappears. That's not a random sequence of events. That's a motive chain. Now, does that prove Chris or his family harmed Sebastian? No. Motive alone doesn't prove action. But it does establish the framework within which behavior must be analyzed. It shows that Sebastian's presence, his voice, his testimony, these things, had consequences. Legal consequences. Consequences that could cost Chris everything he was fighting for. And in forensic analysis, when a child who poses a legal threat to a caregiver suddenly vanishes, investigators don't treat it as coincidence. They treat it as a priority vector. They examine the pressures, they map the incentives. They ask, who benefits from this child's silence? In this case, the answer is clear. Chris benefits. His custody case benefits. His family's objectives benefit. Sebastian's disappearance removes the primary witness in the CPS investigation. It halts the documentation process. It prevents further interviews. And it creates a narrative shift. Suddenly, Chris isn't the parent under investigation. He's the grieving stepfather of a missing child. The optics change, the focus changes, and the legal pressure, it evaporates. That's not speculation. That's the reality of what happens when a key witness in a CPS case disappears. But let's zoom out for a moment, because this isn't just about Chris. It's about a system that failed Sebastian, a system that knew he was at risk, that had opened an investigation, that had documented concerns, and then didn't act fast enough. CPS investigations take time. They require interviews, home visits, documentation, and review. And during that time, the child who made the report is still living in the same home, with the same caregivers, under the same pressures. Sebastian was vulnerable. He had spoken up. He had triggered scrutiny. And he was still in that house, waiting for the system to protect him. But the system didn't move fast enough. And now Sebastian is gone. The custody motive doesn't exist in isolation. It intersects with the CPS investigation, the timeline inconsistencies, the behavioral red flags, and the Alaska departure. Each vector reinforces the others. Each piece of the puzzle fits into a larger picture, and that picture shows a household under immense pressure, a stepfather facing legal consequences, a family allegedly invested in a custody outcome, and a child whose testimony threatened to destroy it all. Sebastian wasn't just a missing person, he was a legal variable. And in the cold calculus of custody battles and CPS investigations, variables get eliminated. So we have a broken timeline, a suspicious departure, legal pressure, and a motive. But what about the evidence? What do the physical clues tell us? From the moment Sebastian Rogers was reported missing, the official narrative was simple. He walked away. A 5-year-old boy, for reasons unknown, left his home in the middle of the night and vanished into the Tennessee wilderness. It's a theory that sounds plausible at first. Teenagers run away. Kids with autism sometimes wander. It happens. But here's the problem. Every single piece of physical evidence contradicts that theory. Not some of the evidence, not most of the evidence, all of it. Let's start with the most damning piece, the scent trail, or rather, the complete absence of one. When a person leaves a location on foot, they leave behind microscopic skin cells, oils, and biological markers. Trained K9 units can detect these markers even hours or days later. In missing person cases, scent tracking dogs are often the first tool deployed because they can tell investigators which direction the person went, where they paused, and where the trail ends. In Sebastian's case, K9 units were brought in immediately. Multiple teams, experienced handlers, dogs trained specifically for tracking missing persons, and they found nothing. No scent trail leading away from the house, no directional indication, no hit at the doorway, the driveway, the yard, or along any nearby roads. The dogs tracked Sebastian's scent inside the home to his bedroom, to specific areas where he spent time, but they could not establish any path leading outside. That's not normal. Even in cases where scent has degraded due to weather or time, dogs typically pick up something. A partial trail, a directional hint, a point of exit. Here, nothing. Now, Chris Proudfoot has claimed in interviews that the dogs did hit outside the house. He's presented this as proof that Sebastian walked out on his own, but that claim is contradicted by law enforcement statements and search documentation. The agencies involved in the search, local police, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and volunteer K9 groups, reported the opposite. No reliable exterior scent trail was found. So either Chris is mistaken, or he's misrepresenting the facts. Either way, the evidence doesn't support his version of events. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the scent trail was somehow compromised. Maybe it rained. Maybe the conditions weren't ideal. Let's move on to the next piece of evidence. Sebastian's shoes. Early reports indicated that all of Sebastian's shoes were found inside the home. When pressed on this detail in later interviews, Katie Proudfoot became evasive. She wouldn't specify how many pairs Sebastian owned or whether any were actually missing. She deflected. She avoided giving a clear answer. That evasiveness is telling, because in most missing person cases, the shoe inventory is straightforward. Parents know exactly how many pairs their child has, what they look like, and whether any are missing. It's one of the first things investigators ask, and it's one of the easiest questions to answer, unless the answer is incriminating. If all of Sebastian's shoes were inside the house, then he left barefoot, and that creates a massive problem for the walk-away theory. Sebastian was on the autism spectrum. Many individuals with ASD have sensory sensitivities, particularly related to touch, temperature, and texture. Walking barefoot on cold, uneven terrain, especially at night, would be extremely uncomfortable, even painful, for someone with those sensitivities. There's no evidence that Sebastian had a history of walking around barefoot, no indication that he avoided wearing shoes, no pattern of behavior that would explain why he'd suddenly leave the house without them in the middle of a cold February night. And if he did leave barefoot, where are the footprints? The terrain around the Proudfoot home includes dirt, mud, grass, and wooded areas. A barefoot teenager walking across that terrain should leave visible impressions, footprints in soft soil, disturbances in vegetation, skin cells on rough surfaces. Trained search teams know how to identify these markers. They look for plant compression, soil displacement, and biological trace evidence. They found none of it. No footprints, No disturbances. No indication that anyone had recently walked through the area surrounding the home. Even in cases where footprints are faint or degraded, experienced searchers can usually detect something. A partial print, a scuff mark, a pattern of disturbed ground. Here, nothing. Then there's the camera footage, or rather, the lack of it. Neighboring homes and businesses in the area had security cameras. Law enforcement reviewed that footage, both voluntarily provided and obtained through requests. They were looking for any sign of Sebastian walking down a road, cutting through a yard, moving through the neighborhood. They found nothing. No sightings, no visual confirmation, no evidence that Sebastian was anywhere near the surrounding streets or properties. Now, the absence of camera footage doesn't prove Sebastian didn't leave, but combined with the absence of a scent trail, the absence of footprints, and the absence of shoes, it becomes part of a larger pattern, a pattern of nothing. Let's talk about dropped items. In cases involving individuals with autism, particularly those who wander or elope, it's statistically common for them to drop personal belongings along the way. Comfort objects, sensory tools, electronic devices, clothing. These items are often found within the first 50 to 100 yards, dropped due to sensory overload, disorientation, or distraction. Sebastian was known to rely on his phone and sensory regulation devices, but none of those items were missing. His phone was found inside the home. No personal belongings were discovered along roads, in wooded areas, or anywhere in the search radius. No dropped items, no trail of belongings, no accidental markers left behind. And here's the kicker. Sebastian had no history of wandering. Elopement, the term used to describe when individuals with autism leave a safe environment without supervision, is more common in younger children. By the teenage years, especially in individuals with stable routines like Sebastian, the behavior is far less frequent. There's no documented history of Sebastian running away, no prior incidents of him leaving the house at night, no pattern of impulsive outdoor behavior. So the walkaway theory requires us to believe that Sebastian, with no history of elopement, suddenly decided to leave his home in the middle of the night, without shoes, without his phone, without any of his comfort items, and managed to do so without leaving a scent trail, without leaving footprints, without being seen on any cameras, and without dropping a single personal belonging. Does that sound plausible to you? What's the weather like where you are right now? I'm curious, drop it in the comments. Because here's what the evidence actually tells us. Sebastian didn't walk away. Every indicator that should be present in a voluntary or involuntary departure is absent. The scent trail, the footprints, the shoes, the camera footage, the dropped items, the behavioral history, none of it exists. And when every exit indicator is absent, investigators are left with one conclusion: the person didn't exit on their own. In forensic terms, this is called evidence-based elimination. You rule out scenarios that are incompatible with the physical evidence, and in this case, the walkaway scenario is incompatible with all of the physical evidence. So if Sebastian didn't walk away, how did he leave the house? That's the question investigators have to ask. And it's a question that shifts the focus inward, back to the people who were inside the home that night, back to the people who controlled Sebastian's environment, back to the people whose timeline doesn't add up. The walkaway theory isn't just weak, it's forensically impossible. And when the official narrative collapses under the weight of evidence, what you're left with is the truth. A truth that's uncomfortable, a truth that's disturbing, but a truth that the evidence supports. Sebastian didn't leave that house on his own. The evidence tells us what didn't happen. But there's more. The way Chris and Katie behaved during interviews reveals something investigators couldn't ignore. When a child goes missing, investigators don't just analyze physical evidence. They analyze behavior. Specifically, the behavior of the people closest to the victim. Because behavior, body language, speech patterns, emotional responses can reveal what words try to hide. In the case of Chris and Katie Proudfoot, their behavior during interviews raises serious questions, not because of one isolated moment, but because of a consistent pattern that doesn't align with what investigators typically see in parents of missing children. Let's start with Katie. In her early interview with WSMV, Katie displays visible distress. She rocks back and forth, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that's consistent with acute anxiety and emotional dysregulation. Rocking is a self-soothing behavior. It's what people do when they're overwhelmed, when their nervous system is in overdrive, when they're struggling to maintain control. It looks genuine. It looks like a mother in crisis. But then, in her interview with Nancy Grace, recorded shortly afterward, that behavior disappears entirely. Katie is completely still. No rocking, no repetitive movement. Her facial expressions are controlled. Her body language is measured. That kind of abrupt shift is unusual. People under genuine, sustained distress don't typically oscillate between high movement anxiety and complete stillness. Their stress responses tend to be consistent across interviews, even if the wording changes. The body doesn't lie as easily as the mouth does. But when someone is managing their presentation, when they're conscious of how they appear, they might overcompensate. They might display exaggerated emotion in one setting and then suppress it entirely in another, trying to find the right way to look. Behavioral analysts call this emotional modulation, and it's a red flag. Now let's talk about Chris. Throughout multiple interviews, Chris displays something that makes investigators uncomfortable: inappropriate affect. He smiles, he laughs, not in moments of relief or nostalgia, but in moments where no contextual trigger exists. He's talking about his missing stepson, about search efforts, about the investigation, and he's smiling. In forensic behavioral analysis, inappropriate smiling isn't treated as evidence of guilt, but it is treated as a signal of internal dissonance, a mismatch between the gravity of the situation and the emotional cues being displayed. It often appears when someone is trying to maintain control over their narrative while managing internal anxiety. It's not that Chris is happy, it's that he's uncomfortable, and that discomfort is leaking through in ways he can't fully control. Beyond the smiling, Chris engages in frequent topic redirection. When interviewers ask him direct questions about the timeline, about CPS, about his activities that night, he doesn't answer them. Instead, he pivots. He talks about how cooperative he's been. He emphasizes how much he respects law enforcement. He reframes the question into something easier to answer. This is a classic deflection technique. It's what people do when they don't want to address the substance of a question. They answer a different question, one that makes them look better. And then there's the way Chris controls Katie's responses. In multiple interviews, Katie begins to answer a question, hesitates, glances at Chris, and then stops. Chris steps in. He answers for her. He reframes what she was about to say. He dominates the narrative. This dynamic is significant. When two people are jointly recounting events, discrepancies between their versions can emerge. A controlling communicator may attempt to prevent those discrepancies by managing the flow of information, by speaking for the other person, by interrupting, by steering the conversation. In several interviews, you can see Katie defer to Chris. She looks to him for approval before speaking. She lets him take over, and when she does speak, her answers often align suspiciously well with his. That's not how genuine recollection works. That's how rehearsed testimony works. And speaking of rehearsal, let's talk about Chris's repeated use of specific phrases. In multiple interviews, Chris describes himself using the exact same 3 words: brash, respectful, direct. He uses this sequence over and over, often inserting it into contexts where it's not responsive to the question being asked. That kind of repetition suggests scripting. It's a phrase he's rehearsed, a self-characterization he's decided to project. It's impression management, an attempt to control how people perceive him. Innocent people don't usually spend time crafting a personal brand during a missing child investigation. They're too focused on finding their child. But people who are concerned about how they're being perceived, they script, they rehearse, they repeat. Then there's the eye contact, or rather, the lack of it. Across interviews, both Chris and Katie show patterns of gaze aversion. They look down when discussing critical details. They avoid looking at each other. And when they do make eye contact, it's often followed by a hesitation, a correction, or a shift in narrative direction. Behavioral experts note that people telling the truth often rely on mutual gaze for reassurance or corroboration. They look at each other to confirm details, to draw strength, to stay aligned. But people recalling fabricated or altered events often avoid eye contact because looking at each other can expose discrepancies. It can reveal doubt. It can break the performance. In the Proudfoot interviews, mutual eye contact is rare, and when it does occur, it's almost always followed by a narrative adjustment. And then there's the phrase that keeps coming up, put the dogs up. Chris and Katie use this phrase repeatedly when describing their nighttime routine. It's presented as a normal part of securing the house before bed, but here's the problem. The phrase doesn't align with the home's described layout. According to their own statements, Sebastian would have passed by the dogs to reach the kitchen. That implies the dogs were in a common area, along his normal route. But when asked about the nighttime routine, Katie describes putting the dogs up in a way that suggests they were moved to a separate location. So where were the dogs? And why does the phrasing feel rehearsed rather than descriptive? When a repeated phrase doesn't align with physical logistics, investigators consider whether it's functioning as a scripted line, a placeholder that sounds normal but doesn't actually clarify what happened. Here's what behavioral analysts look for in interviews with parents of missing children: uncontrolled emotional leakage, fragmented sentences, spontaneous recall, unpredictable reactions. Genuine distress doesn't follow a script. It's messy, it's inconsistent, it's raw. But the Proudfoot interviews contain structured patterns, controlled movement, redirected questioning, rehearsed phrasing, coordinated narrative alignment. That's not the behavior of parents focused solely on finding their child. That's the behavior of people focused on managing how they're perceived. And here's the thing. People under intense scrutiny sometimes do try to present themselves in a composed, logical manner, especially if they feel unfairly judged. So these behaviors don't automatically indicate guilt, but they do indicate something: awareness. Awareness that they're being watched, awareness that their words matter, awareness that inconsistencies could be damaging. And that awareness, combined with the timeline contradictions, the CPS pressure, the custody motive, and the absence of physical evidence supporting the walkaway theory, it all adds up. Individually, these behaviors might mean nothing, but together, they form a pattern of control, a pattern of deflection, a pattern of performance. And in a case where a child has vanished without a trace, where the timeline doesn't hold, where the physical evidence points inward, behavioral red flags become part of the investigative framework. They don't prove what happened to Sebastian, but they reveal who's trying to control the story and why. In missing person investigations, transparency is critical. Investigators need complete information: medical history, behavioral patterns, daily routines, medications, relationships, conflicts. Every detail matters. And parents of missing children, desperate to find their child, typically provide that information freely. They overshare. They volunteer details. They want investigators to have every possible tool. But Chris Proudfoot did the opposite. Throughout the investigation, Chris engaged in a pattern of information withholding and narrative control. He didn't just avoid certain topics, he actively managed what information was released, how it was framed, and who had access to it. Let's start with Sebastian's medication. Sebastian was on medication. That's been confirmed. But the specifics, what medication, what dosage, what it was prescribed for, have never been publicly disclosed. And when asked about it in interviews, Chris deflects. Why does this matter? Because medication details are critical in missing person cases. If Sebastian was on medication for a behavioral condition, for anxiety, for sleep regulation, that information helps search teams understand his likely state of mind, his physical capabilities, and his decision-making patterns. It helps medical professionals assess survival timelines. It helps the public recognize symptoms if he's spotted. Withholding that information doesn't protect Sebastian. It hinders the search. And yet, Chris has consistently refused to provide clarity. He frames it as protecting Sebastian's privacy. But Sebastian is missing. Privacy concerns don't outweigh the need for actionable information in a search effort. Unless the medication details reveal something Chris doesn't want public, something that contradicts the narrative, something that raises questions about what was happening in that household. Then there's the vehicle issue. Multiple community members and online researchers have asked whether the vehicles in the Proudfoot household were searched, specifically whether they were forensically examined before Chris's parents allegedly left for Alaska. It's a reasonable question. In missing child cases, household vehicles are routinely inspected. Cadaver dogs are brought in. Forensic teams check for biological evidence, hair, fibers, fluids. It's standard procedure. But when asked about vehicle searches, Chris becomes evasive. He says law enforcement has done everything they need to do. He insists he's been fully cooperative, but he won't directly confirm whether the vehicles were searched, when they were searched, or what the results were. That's not transparency. That's deflection. If the vehicles were searched and cleared, why not just say so? Why leave the question hanging? The only reason to avoid a direct answer is if the answer is problematic, or if no search occurred at all. And then there's Chris's repeated claims of cooperation. In nearly every interview, Chris emphasizes how cooperative he's been with law enforcement. He says it unprompted. He says it defensively. He says it as if repetition will make it true. We've cooperated fully. We've given them everything they've asked for. We've done everything law enforcement has requested. But cooperation isn't something you have to advertise. If you're genuinely cooperating, investigators confirm it. The evidence speaks for itself. You don't need to repeatedly assert it in interviews. When someone constantly emphasizes their cooperation, it often signals the opposite, an awareness that their behavior is being scrutinized, and an attempt to preemptively defend against accusations of obstruction. And here's the thing. Chris's claims of cooperation don't align with his other behaviors. He withholds medication details. He deflects questions about vehicle searches. He changes his story about CPS. He lies about taking a polygraph. That's not cooperation. That's selective disclosure. It's providing just enough information to appear helpful while withholding the details that matter most. Let's revisit the contradictions. Chris says the CPS incident happened 3 years ago. Then he admits it happened when Sebastian was 15, which means it was recent. Chris says he took a polygraph and passed. Then he admits he never took one. Chris says CPS didn't file anything. Then he describes the CPS worker coming to the house and interviewing the children. Katie says she heard the thud at 10 p.m. Then she says it was 1 a.m. Then she says Sebastian responded verbally. Then she doesn't mention a response at all. These aren't minor inconsistencies. These are foundational contradictions. And they all serve the same purpose: to obscure the truth. When you can't keep your story straight, you create confusion. And confusion buys time. It muddies the investigative waters. It makes it harder for people to pin down what actually happened. But here's the thing. Innocent people don't usually need to control the narrative. They just tell the truth. They don't rehearse phrases. They don't deflect questions. They don't withhold critical information. They don't change their timeline. They don't lie about polygraphs. They tell investigators everything they know, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it makes them look bad, because finding their child is more important than managing their image. Chris Proudfoot has done the opposite. He's managed his image at every turn. He's controlled the flow of information. He's deflected, contradicted, and withheld. And that behavior, combined with everything else we've examined, paints a picture of someone who isn't focused on finding Sebastian. He's focused on protecting himself. Narrative control is a defensive strategy. It's what people do when they know the truth is damaging, when they know that full transparency will expose them, when they know that the story, if told honestly, will lead investigators straight to them. And in this case, every act of withholding, every deflection, every contradiction, it all points in the same direction, inward, back to the Proudfoot household, back to the people who were there that night, back to the people whose timeline doesn't hold, back to the people who had motive, opportunity, and something to hide. I want to hear from you. Have you ever followed a case where the family's behavior just didn't sit right? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes our instincts pick up on things before the evidence does. And in this case, the instincts and the evidence are telling the same story. So where does all of this lead us? In forensic investigations, there's a principle called convergence of evidence. It's the idea that when multiple independent lines of inquiry all point in the same direction, the probability of accuracy increases exponentially. One piece of evidence can be questioned, two can be coincidence. But when 7, 8, 9 separate vectors all converge on the same conclusion, that's when investigators know they're looking at the truth. In the case of Sebastian Rogers, we have exactly that. Convergence. Let's map it out. Vector 1. The collapsed timeline. Chris and Katie Proudfoot cannot maintain a consistent account of the hours surrounding Sebastian's disappearance. The thud happens at 10 p.m., then 1 a.m. Sebastian responds verbally, then he doesn't. Katie is reading, on the phone, asleep on the couch all at the same time, apparently. Chris claims he took a polygraph, then admits he didn't. The timeline doesn't just have gaps, it has contradictions that are forensically impossible to reconcile. When caregivers can't keep their story straight about the last known hours of a missing child's life, investigators don't treat it as stress-induced confusion, they treat it as a red flag. Because the truth doesn't change, only lies do. Vector 2. The Alaska departure. Within days of Sebastian's disappearance, Chris's parents allegedly drove over 4,000 miles to Alaska. Not flew, drove. They left during the critical early phase of the investigation, when most families stay close, when search efforts are at their peak, when every available person is needed. The timing is suspicious. The method is suspicious. The destination remote, difficult to investigate, with minimal border scrutiny is suspicious. And the question of whether their vehicle was forensically examined before they left remains unanswered. Sudden long-distance travel by individuals connected to a missing child's household is a known displacement behavior. It creates physical distance. It removes potential evidence from the jurisdiction, and it signals awareness that staying close might be problematic. Vector 3. CPS pressure. Sebastian reported that Chris hit him with a belt. That report triggered a CPS investigation, and despite Chris's attempts to frame it as ancient history, the timeline proves it was recent weeks before Sebastian disappeared. An active CPS investigation isn't just bureaucratic paperwork. It's a legal threat. It's documentation that can be used in court. It's evidence that validates allegations. And in this case, it was evidence that could destroy Chris's custody case. Sebastian wasn't just a child in that home. He was a witness, a reporter, a legal obstacle, and his voice was the thing standing between Chris and everything he was fighting for. Vector 4. Custody motive. Chris was fighting for custody of his daughter, Faith. A validated CPS report about his treatment of Sebastian would have been devastating to that case. It would have corroborated his ex-wife's allegations. It would have shown a pattern of inappropriate discipline. It would have ended his chances. Sebastian's testimony was the linchpin. If he stood by his report, if CPS believed him, if the investigation moved forward, Chris's custody battle was over. That's not speculation. That's how family court works, and it establishes a clear, measurable motive for wanting Sebastian's voice silenced. Vector 5. Physical evidence rejects the walk-away theory. No scent trail, no footprints, no shoes, no camera footage, no dropped items, no behavioral history of wandering. Every single indicator that should be present in a voluntary or involuntary departure is absent. The physical evidence doesn't just fail to support the walk-away theory, it actively contradicts it. When K9 units can't establish an exit path, when all of a child's shoes are inside the home, when no trace evidence exists outside the residence, the forensic conclusion is clear. The person didn't leave on foot. And if Sebastian didn't walk away, then how did he leave? And who moved him? Vector 6. Behavioral indicators. Katie's shifting demeanor, Chris's inappropriate smiling, rehearsed phrases, controlled responses, eye contact avoidance, deflection, topic redirection. These aren't isolated quirks, they're patterns. Patterns that behavioral analysts recognize as indicators of managed performance rather than genuine distress. People telling the truth don't need to rehearse, they don't need to control the narrative, they don't need to answer for each other, they just tell what happened. But people hiding the truth, they script, they deflect, they manage, and that's exactly what we see in the Proudfoot interviews. Vector 7. Narrative control and information withholding. Chris withholds Sebastian's medication details. He deflects questions about vehicle searches. He contradicts himself about CPS, polygraphs, and timelines. He emphasizes cooperation while simultaneously refusing to provide clarity on critical details. That's not the behavior of someone focused on finding a missing child. That's the behavior of someone focused on protecting themselves. Innocent people don't withhold information that could help a search effort. They don't deflect. They don't manage the narrative. They tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, because finding their child is the only thing that matters. But Chris has done the opposite at every turn. So here's what we have. 7 independent lines of evidence. 7 separate vectors. And every single one of them points in the same direction. Inward. Not toward the woods. Not toward a random abduction. Not toward a voluntary disappearance. toward the Proudfoot household, toward the people who were there that night, toward the people whose timeline doesn't hold, toward the people who had motive, opportunity, and something to hide. In forensic terms, when external explanations fail, when the physical evidence, the behavioral indicators, the timeline, and the motive all reject the official narrative, internal causation becomes the focus. The question is no longer, where did Sebastian go? It's, what happened inside the Proudfoot home? Because the evidence doesn't support the idea that Sebastian left on his own. It doesn't support the idea that he wandered into the woods. It doesn't support the idea that a stranger took him. What it does support is that something happened inside that house. Something that Chris and Katie can't talk about honestly. Something that required a fractured timeline, a controlled narrative, and the removal of a child whose voice had become too dangerous. And here's the part that breaks my heart. Sebastian deserved safety. He deserved to be heard. He deserved to come home. He spoke up. He trusted someone enough to report what was happening to him. He did exactly what we tell children to do. He told the truth, and then he was gone. That's not a coincidence. That's not bad luck. That's a consequence. Sebastian's voice was a threat, and threats, in households under pressure, get eliminated. The convergence of evidence doesn't just suggest what happened, it maps it. It shows the pressure points, the motive chain, the behavioral indicators, and the physical impossibilities. And all of it, every single piece, points to the same conclusion. Sebastian Rogers didn't leave that house on his own, and the people who know what happened to him are the same people who can't keep their story straight. As of today, Sebastian Rogers has been missing for months, and despite the massive search efforts, despite the thousands of hours invested by law enforcement, despite the tireless work of volunteers and community members, there have been no arrests. The investigation remains open, active, ongoing. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation continues to classify this as a missing person case. The FBI remains involved. Local law enforcement in Sumner County is still following leads, reviewing evidence, and conducting interviews. But publicly, there's been silence. No major updates, no press conferences announcing breakthroughs, no named suspects, no charges filed. And that silence is frustrating. It's agonizing for those who followed this case, for those who see the same patterns investigators see, for those who believe the evidence speaks clearly. But here's what we need to understand. The absence of arrests doesn't mean the absence of progress. Investigations of this magnitude, cases involving missing children, potential foul play, and complex family dynamics take time. Investigators don't just need suspicion. They need evidence that meets the standard for prosecution. They need forensic confirmation. They need witness testimony. They need a case that can withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. And building that case, especially when the primary suspects are the people who controlled the victim's environment, requires meticulous work. Investigators are likely examining digital evidence, phone records, text messages, social media activity, search histories. They're reviewing financial transactions. They're conducting forensic analysis on vehicles, on the home, on any physical evidence collected during the initial search. They're re-interviewing witnesses. They're looking for inconsistencies. They're building a timeline that can't be disputed. And they're waiting for someone to talk, waiting for a crack in the narrative, waiting for the pressure to become unbearable. Because in cases like this, the truth often emerges not from a single piece of evidence, but from the slow, relentless accumulation of pressure. People make mistakes. They contradict themselves. They confide in the wrong person. They break. And when they do, investigators are ready. But while law enforcement works behind the scenes, the public has a role to play. And that role is critical. Community pressure matters. Public awareness matters. When a case stays in the spotlight, when people continue to ask questions, when the story doesn't fade into obscurity, it keeps the pressure on. It reminds investigators that people are watching. It reminds potential witnesses that their information could be the key. And it reminds those who know what happened that the truth will not stay buried forever. In Sebastian's case, the community has been relentless. Local residents have organized searches. They've distributed flyers. They've kept his name alive on social media. They've refused to let this case disappear. And that matters more than you might think. Because when cases go cold, It's often not because the evidence isn't there, it's because public attention fades. Media moves on, people stop talking, and in that silence, those responsible breathe easier. But Sebastian's case hasn't gone silent, and it can't. Not when the evidence is this clear, not when the contradictions are this glaring, not when a child's life is at stake. There are people out there who know more than they've said. Maybe they're family members who've heard things they weren't supposed to hear. Maybe they're friends who were confided in. Maybe they're neighbors who saw something that didn't sit right but didn't want to get involved. And to those people, I want to say this: your silence protects the wrong people. If you know anything about what happened to Sebastian Rogers, don't stay silent. You don't have to post publicly. You don't have to put your name out there. But you can contact law enforcement. You can submit an anonymous tip. You can reach out to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, to the FBI, to local authorities. You can comment below. You can share this video. You can make sure Sebastian's story reaches someone who has the missing piece. Because here's the truth: Sebastian's voice was silenced, but ours don't have to be. Every share, every comment, every conversation about this case is an act of resistance against the silence that allows injustice to thrive. It's a refusal to let Sebastian be forgotten. It's a demand for accountability, and it works. Public pressure has solved cases before. It's brought justice to victims who were written off. It's forced reinvestigations. It's led to arrests, to confessions, to convictions. Sebastian deserves that. He deserves a community that won't stop asking questions. He deserves a public that won't let his case fade. He deserves justice. So if you've watched this far, if this case has affected you, if you believe like I do that the evidence points to a truth that hasn't been fully acknowledged yet, then do something. Share this video. Talk about Sebastian. Keep his name in circulation. Keep the pressure on. Because the people who know what happened are counting on this case going away. They're counting on people losing interest. They're counting on the noise dying down. Don't let that happen. Sebastian Rogers was a real person. A 5-year-old boy with hopes, with struggles, with a voice that mattered. He spoke up when it was hard. He trusted the system to protect him, and the system failed him. But we don't have to. We can keep his story alive. We can demand answers. We can refuse to let those responsible hide behind silence and deflection. The investigation is ongoing, and so is our responsibility to Sebastian. Don't stay silent. Don't look away. Don't let this case become another unsolved tragedy. Sebastian's voice was silenced. Let's make sure his story isn't. We started this investigation with a question that challenges the official narrative, a question that the evidence demands we ask. What if Sebastian Rogers never left home? What if the answer to his disappearance isn't in the woods, isn't in some random abduction, isn't in a voluntary walk-away scenario that defies every piece of physical evidence? What if the answer has been there all along, inside the walls of the Proudfoot household, hidden behind a fractured timeline, buried beneath rehearsed statements and narrative control? The evidence doesn't lie. The K9 units found no scent trail leading away from the home. Sebastian's shoes were inside. No footprints were found. No camera footage captured him leaving. No dropped items marked a path. His behavioral history showed no pattern of wandering. The timeline doesn't hold. Chris and Katie can't maintain a consistent account of the hours surrounding Sebastian's disappearance. The thud changes time. The activities shift. The polygraph claims collapse. The CPS timeline gets exposed. Every version contradicts the last. The behavior doesn't match. Inappropriate smiling, deflection, rehearsed phrases, narrative control, information withholding, eye contact avoidance. These aren't the behaviors of parents desperate to find their child. These are the behaviors of people managing a story. And the motive? It's undeniable. Sebastian's CPS report threatened Chris's custody case. His testimony could have validated every allegation Chris's ex-wife made. His voice was a legal obstacle. And then, before the investigation could conclude, before Sebastian could testify again, he was gone. 7 independent lines of evidence, all pointing inward, all converging on the same conclusion. Something happened inside that house, something that required Sebastian's silence, something that Chris and Katie can't talk about, honestly. And until they do, Sebastian won't get justice. Justice for Sebastian means facing uncomfortable truths. It means acknowledging that the people who were supposed to protect him may be the very people responsible for his disappearance. It means refusing to accept a narrative that the evidence rejects. It means not looking away. If this case shook you, you're not alone. We're building a community that refuses to let these stories disappear, a community that demands accountability, a community that gives victims a voice when the system fails them. Subscribe, hit the bell, because we're covering cases like this every week, cases the mainstream media won't touch, cases where the official story doesn't match the evidence, cases where justice is still waiting. And drop a comment letting me know what case I should cover next. Your voice matters. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Together, we're making sure that victims like Sebastian aren't forgotten. Because here's the truth. Sebastian Rogers was failed by the people who were supposed to protect him. He was failed by a system that didn't move fast enough. He was failed by a narrative that prioritized comfort over truth. But he doesn't have to be failed by us. We can keep asking questions. We can keep demanding answers. We can keep his name in the light until the truth comes out. And it will come out. It always does. The pressure builds. The contradictions pile up. Someone talks, someone breaks, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds its way to the surface. Sebastian Rogers deserves the truth. And the truth is still out there, waiting to be found.